Well, in this month, we're looking at the book of Judges. I picked 4 of the judges, opportunity to tell you their story, so you learn a little bit about Old Testament history, but also see if we can learn a lesson from each one. So today's message is from Judges chapter 11, Jephthah, the man who spoke too soon. So let me ask for a show of hands, see if I'm the only one in here. Have you ever said something where after you said it, you wish you hadn't said it? Now, I know that's me. Anybody else? There's a few of you. Any of you sitting next to someone you could raise your hand for them? Yeah. You know, it's so commonplace for us to do it, where we have to back up, take something back, apologize. We understand that that's what happens. Doesn't mean we want it that way. We try to do better, but we've made that same mistake. We're going to talk about a man who made it, but he made it huge. Had a lot of implications when he got done. And that's the story of Jephthah, the man who spoke too soon. Now, when we're introduced to him in chapter 11, verse 1 begins this way. Jephthah was a mighty warrior. That's how he's introduced to us, a mighty warrior. But you know, before he becomes that mighty warrior, there's a story that leads us to that. Now, in the days of Jephthah, days of the judges, there were always people attacking Israel, coming from left and right, but somebody would attack. The people would cry out for help, Lord, save us, deliver us. And then God would raise up a judge. And a judge was basically a leader of the people, but one who led an army into battle and gave the Israelites a victory. On this occasion, as they're being attacked, and they need a leader, God raised up Jephthah, a mighty warrior. But when Jephthah began his story in the beginning of chapter 11, he was a troubled youth. Now here's his story. His father was a very prestigious, well-respected man among the Israelites. His mother, not so much. You see, his mother is not the wife of his father. No, it was a prostitute. You can see where that's going to be some family issues. And when he grows up and his brothers and sisters grow up, they don't like their half-brother. And it got to the point where they disowned him. They drove him away and said, you will not share an inheritance with us. And he was off on his own. Now, you know, when you're in a situation like that, having to fend for yourself, that's an occasion where it will either make you or break you. In Jephthah's case, he became tough. He became a tough fighter. And we're told in the text he gathered around him a band of men, all just like him. In the New International, it treats them kindly. It says it was a band of adventurers. In the Hebrew text, it describes them more as miscreants and ne'er-do-wells. Basically, it's a bunch of renegades. It's almost like pirates getting together, and together they do whatever they have to do to survive, and they'll take what they have to take. They'll fight where they need to fight, and that's where he developed his reputation as a mighty warrior, because he and his band of men were always up to something. But you know, that's going to eventually lead to his opportunity to shine. Because what's going to happen is, in chapter 11, Israel's under attack. They need a warrior to lead them. And so the leaders of the people asked Jephthah, will you take an army and fight for us? Now you can imagine his response. You talking to me? You drove me away. You wanted nothing to do with me. And now you're asking me to come help you. Now they're going to have to eat some crow. And he's going to come because this is his opportunity. It's an opportunity for him to rise up and become the hero of the story. And he will. We're told in chapter 11 that God's Spirit came upon him and filled him with power. And then he went forth and had a great victory over the enemies. And if it had stopped right there, that would have been one of the great stories of the book of Judges. But it didn't stop there. Jephthah made one mistake, just one, but it was a huge mistake. It came from his hasty words. He made a promise to God, and it was a very foolish, hasty promise. Now, the promise is told to us in verses 30 and 31. As he's preparing for battle, here's what he said to God. He said, Lord, if you will give me the Ammonites in my hand, if you'll take my enemies and let me have a victory over them, here's what I'll do when I return home. And the first thing that comes out of the house, the first thing from the door that I encounter, I'll take that thing and I will sacrifice it to you. I'll offer it as a burnt offering. Now, you know, if you hear that on the surface, it sounds pretty noble. That sounds biblical. No, it's pretty stupid. Because he hadn't thought through this promise. And what's going to happen is this promise made to God will turn out to be words to regret. He'll wish he'd never said those words. Because I don't know what he imagined, what he thought was going to be the first thing that came out of his house, but I got an idea. Because I know what houses were like back in biblical times there in the Middle East. I've seen those kind of houses still to this day. For example, you go to India, in the rural areas, you'll still see the same thing. A little house, simple thing. And if they had a few animals, goats and chickens and whatever, they kept them near the front. Oftentimes a goat would be tethered right there to the door. They'd have the food and the water right there at the door, or even sometimes inside the door. Keep the animals close so they don't disappear on you. And so he probably imagined the first thing he'd run into is a goat, a chicken, or whatever. He's prepared to sacrifice that. But see, his daughter heard that her father was coming down the road, and she ran past those critters, and she was there to greet her dad, and that was not what he expected. And thus he regretted the words he said, because now he's put himself in a bad situation, because he's made a promise that's going to be hard for him to fulfill. Now here's where the scriptures speak to us time and time again. Bible says over and over, you be careful that when you make a promise and you know God's listening, make sure that you think carefully before you promise. Think before you promise. Take, for example, from the book of Proverbs, chapter 25, verse 20. In the book of Proverbs, he'll say, all right, you got to be careful that when you are speaking, that you don't speak rashly, you don't speak hastily, that you don't dedicate something to the Lord without thinking it through, because that's a foolish thing to first hastily dedicate and then turn right around and then consider what it was I just vowed. That's just asking for trouble. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, Solomon gives you that same advice. In chapter 5, Solomon says, now, don't be rushing with your mouth. Don't be hasty with your heart to utter anything before the Lord. Don't let your mouth lead you into sin. Don't turn around later and protest to the temple messenger and say, hey, wait a minute, my vow was a mistake. I didn't mean it. I want to take it back. Because why should God be angry at you because of your words and then destroy the works of your hands? You see, scriptures warn us, don't make the mistake of Jephthah, to make a promise before you've actually thought about what it was you promised. You may live to regret your words. Now, you know, today, we look at the story of Jephthah, and we think that's an easy thing to fix. If you ever make a bad promise, just don't do it. That's the popular opinion. You know, if you say something, you later decide, I don't want to do it, just don't do it. It's that simple. It may seem that simple today for the way we think, but back in Jephthah's day, that's not how people thought. It wasn't part of the culture. Because back in those days, as they are very focused on God and His will and His word, it's hard for them to back down from a promise. You see, Jephthah felt a solemn duty to honor his word and to protect his integrity. And you can see that clearly in the text. You'll see that, for example, as he speaks in verse 35 and 36. In verse 35, he says, oh no, this is terrible, it's a tragedy. He says to his daughter, I want you to understand. He says, I made a promise to the Lord, and I cannot break my vow. But you know what? She's on the same page. Verse 36, his daughter says, oh, my father, my father. She's trying to calm him down. She says, I know. You made a promise, and you need to fulfill your vow. Now, in this story of Jephthah, I'm not particularly a fan of Jephthah, the man who just spoke and didn't think about the consequences. I don't like that. I like her. If anything, I think she's a hero here because she has a respect for honor and integrity. And this is going to cost her. But she still says, if you made a promise to God, you need to do what you promised. I like her a lot, like her integrity. Even so, we still got a problem here. And thus it leads to what I'll call the messy outcome. This is not going to end well no matter what he does, because it's going to be a problem. A messy outcome, I call it, because Jephthah finds himself between a rock and a hard place. You know that expression. Between a rock and a hard place, and he doesn't like either one, and it doesn't matter what he does, it's still going to be wrong. See, he's got to decide, do you break your vow? That's not right. Or do you sacrifice your daughter? And that's not right. And he's stuck between two choices, and neither is a good choice. The rock and the hard place, I call it. Once again, I got to remind you how scriptures speak, because Jephthah's a man who thinks these kind of thoughts. I give you Psalm 15 as an example. Psalm 15, the Jews memorized this after it was written. Here's what it says. Who can come into your holy sacred tent, the tabernacle, and come up on your holy hill? He's describing the worship place, the sanctuary. But the tabernacle, the sanctuary on earth, was a symbol of God's sanctuary in heaven. And so basically he's asking the question, who do you welcome to come before you now in worship, and one day they'll be with you forever and ever, amen? Look how he describes the person that God welcomes in his sight. One whose walk is blameless. One who does what is right. One who speaks the truth from the heart. And then look at this. And one who keeps his vow, even if it hurts, and he doesn't change his mind. You know, Scriptures speak like that time and time again. And if you're immersed in Scriptures and you try to do what the Bible says, this is a challenge for a man like Jephthah. Because on the one hand, he doesn't want to do anything to his daughter, but he values a word of honor, a word of promise, and he is stuck in this rock and hard place. Now what do I do? Which may make you curious, so what did he do? If you've never read the story, and if you have read the story, you get down to the last verse, the final verse, you know what it says? And Jephthah fulfilled his vow. I'd like a little more detail. I'd like to know more about what happened next, and it doesn't tell you any story. Doesn't tell you about a sacrifice or this or that or tears shed. It just says he fulfilled his vow. And here's where both Jews and Christians have not agreed on what happened next as they try to take that simple verse and figure out what it means. And so, for example, here's an ending to the story. You might actually like this one. One ending to the story is that what happened was he took the word sacrifice and stretched it a bit. From a literal sacrifice that involves blood to a spiritual sacrifice, and gave his daughter over to the priest and the sanctuary. And from that day forward, she'll no longer live in his household and be part of his family, but rather she will now serve at the sanctuary, an assistant to the priest, doing service and ministry for the rest of her life. And the reason some suggest that is because the text does emphasize more than once that she's a young lady, never married, never had kids. And she accepts that fact. I will never marry. I'll never have kids. And so some have suggested, well, the Roman Catholic Church says this, that she's an example of an early version of nuns who give up a life of what they may have dreamed of as a small girl. I'm going to marry and have a family. No, instead I'm going to commit myself to the Lord and serve Him with everything I've got. And she may be an early example of that. Now, the truth is, there are examples of that back in those Old Testament days in the book of 1 Samuel. That's what happened to Samuel. His mother was barren, unable to have kids, so she prayed to the Lord, said, if you'll give me a baby, let me enjoy being a mother at least for a short while, I'll give you the baby. And she did. After the baby was weaned from the mother's milk, she took the child to the priest, said, he's now yours. And the priest raised the kid, served in the ministry of the sanctuary, and then one day grew up to be the priest and prophet Samuel. So that kind of thing was done. So some have suggested that's what he did, took the word sacrifice, stretched it a bit, and her life was sacrificed in a spiritual sense, a ministry. There's some other possibilities that are mentioned as well, but I tell you, there's also the literal, that he did what the text said he was going to do, that he offered a sacrifice, remember those words, a burnt offering to the Lord. And while you can take the word sacrifice and stretch it a bit, it's hard to do much with burnt offering, and so maybe that's what he did. If you're thinking, there's no way. There is no way a father is going to sacrifice a child. You do recall that God spoke to Abraham and said, "Would you take your son Isaac up to Mount Moriah and sacrifice him to me?" And he did. Took him up there, put him on the altar, and drew the knife back. Only when God stopped him did he not go through with it, but he was ready to do it. God told him to. Some of you may know the story of King Saul and his son Jonathan. They're fighting a battle. King Saul spoke without thinking. He says, "I don't want any soldier to eat or drink until we have a complete victory, and if you do, you'll die." His son Jonathan didn't even hear the rule. He didn't know his father said it. He's over here, he's fighting, he's tired, he's hungry and thirsty, so he has a little something to eat. Word gets back to his father, said, "I don't care who it is, he dies." You see, there are people like that would go through with a sacrifice. Fact is, in Middle Eastern culture, even to this day, you sometimes run into that kind of thing. The idea that the honor of the family is at stake here, that someone in the family has dishonored this family and they need to die for the sake of the family. And that's a plot line you'll ever so often see. You know those TV shows like Law and Order? I've seen this more than once, where you'll have some young lady, she shows up here in New York City, getting a university education, adapting more to Western ways. Next thing you know, she does something. It's contrary to her culture back home. And before you know it, there's a father, an uncle, an older brother who's here, and his job is to bring her back, force her if necessary, because when she goes back home, they're going to stone her to death. And that puts the lawyers in the position of trying to stop that from happening. You see, it may not be the way you and I think, but there are people who put such a high value on honor, they would be willing to sacrifice even their own child. So what really happened to her? Well, I don't know. I know what I hope. I hope she was able to get through that somehow, some way. But listen, no matter what happened to her, her father made a rash promise, and she's the one that has to pay for it. Which brings me to a phrase I want you to remember: the sins of the father. Sins of the father. That phrase shows up all through the Old Testament, the sins of the father. And you know why? Because it's the reality of life. That sometimes someone who's the leader, a man, a patriarch, he does something, he says something, and then it goes bad. And there are negative consequences, and those consequences oftentimes roll over and touch others, the family, and sometimes to the second and third generation. Scriptures speak about that often. And we see that kind of thing happening. For example, there would be a man who does something wrong, and he's punished, but they also confiscate his property, and the family's kicked out of their home. Or someone like Achan, who in the book of Joshua, he steals something that's sacred to God, and when he's found out, they take him and his family and stone him to death. Sins of the father passing on to the children. Actually, that principle is still alive and well today. That is to say, sometimes you and I, we can do something that has negative consequences, and it rolls over to someone else. You know, a lot of us in this room, we're willing to take our lumps. Listen, if this goes bad, I'll take my lumps, but sometimes your lumps get spread out to family members who didn't have a say in the matter. They weren't a part of the decision. You did it. And then they take some of the hits as well. See, the sins of the father is a real thing. It happens. And Jephthah is an example of a man who made a hasty promise without thinking it through, and his daughter suffered for it in some fashion. You look at the man Jephthah, I call him the man who spoke too soon, and there's got to be some good lessons you and I can learn from that. So let me give you lessons. Here's lesson number 1, and it is the most obvious of all. Think before you promise. Before you make a promise to someone, before you make a promise to God, think before you promise. And let me flesh that out just a little bit for you. When you think before you promise, think about the implications for others. Think about how what I'm setting out to do here, how that impacts others around me. One of the classic stories I've heard time and time again in my years is somebody telling me about a family where the man, the husband, the father, he's at work, he's having to make a decision. Boss wants him to move, do this, do that. There's a job opportunity, there's a new job offer. He accepts it, he says, yes, I'll do it, and then goes home and tells the wife and kids, we're moving. Didn't take into account what that does for them and how they might feel about such a thing, leaving family and friends to go off somewhere else. You see, I advise you ought to have a good family talk before big, important decisions are made that have implications on everyone. We forget that sometimes, don't we? And sometimes, instead of thinking, we just act and we do what looks right to us, and somebody else pays for it as well. So I recommend that you want to think about the implication on others. I also recommend this: don't promise more than you can deliver. We do that oftentimes as well. Oh, I'll do this, I'll do that. Next thing you know, you look at your calendar, you can't. Or you look at your resources and you can't. And we overcommit. Good intentions, we meant well, but that doesn't help the person on the other end of the promise. Think through carefully. Don't commit more than you can actually pull off. I'll tell you another thing I advise, because I've seen this in my own family. Beware of ultimatums. Beware of making those always never kind of statements, especially in the heat of the moment. Like, for example, you walk out on me, I'll never speak to you again. Hey, you do that and you'll never be welcome back in my house. I've seen that where that was said, for example, father to a child. At some point, things change. Attitudes change. And hopefully you'll eat your words, but you see, you put yourself in a bad situation. You said something you shouldn't have said. I think if Jephthah thinks it's anything, and that is this: think about what our actions do for someone around us. Don't promise rashly, but rather think before you promise. I'm going to give you another application as we're on the roll here, and that is this: think before you speak. Let's apply this across the board to all of our relationships. I'm thinking about in the home. Husband, wife, talking to each other. Parent and child. Talking among our friends, our co-laborers at work, at school, whatever. In our daily conversation, think before we say any words that we say. Make sure that we don't have to take those words back. That's just a good rule of thumb. Take a look at this passage from the book of Proverbs. As he's trying to warn us about thinking carefully, here's what he says. Those who are righteous of heart, those who want to do what's right. I think that's many of us in this room, right? I want to do what's right. Those who are righteous of heart, they will weigh their answers. I'm going to reply to what you just said. I'm going to speak about the current situation. I'm going to do this, do that, but I'm going to weigh my words first before I do it. Because otherwise, someone who just goes ahead and just speaks rashly, it creates all types of trouble. The wicked gush forth with evil, he says. Yeah, that's good advice. Weigh your words. That's think before you speak. Take a look at this from Jesus, though. Matthew chapter 12, verse 36. He challenges us to think about our careless words. God will judge your careless words. Now, in the Greek, what that means is a word you said without a care. I wasn't thinking. I've done this. Maybe you have as well. You say something, and then afterwards, when you see the demeanor of the other person, they're getting offended. What are you getting offended about? And they tell me how they heard what I just said. I didn't mean that. I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. And we can try to take it back, but I've already said it. It's a little late. You see, careless words without a careful thought through it before I said it, Jesus warns us, don't do that. That's good advice for all of us. How about this passage from Proverbs chapter 18, verse 17? He describes a courtroom. He says, in a courtroom, the first one to get up and speak and testify, he sounds right. Till the next guy gets up and cross-examines and says a different story. And now you're thinking, okay, wait a minute. You know what that principle is. Listen to both sides. Before you form a judgment, get both sides and then form a judgment. Because you know what's going to happen. Sometimes when you hear both sides, you're going to go with side one. It was right. But sometimes you're going to switch and go with side two. And sometimes you may, like I do sometimes, I want out of this. You guys can fight it out. Whatever your reaction is, that's the right way to deal with all things, is get both sides. It's what you want done when somebody's talking about you. They haven't talked to me. They ought to come talk to me, you're thinking. You see, that's the way we deal with things, if we want to think first before we speak. How about this from James chapter 1, verse 19? Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Anger happens. Anger, frustration, all those things happen. And there's something to be said, but I find I'm better at saying what I have to say if I don't say it right now. If I first calm down a bit, think it through, and then carefully choose my words and actions. That's what James is recommending. He's getting that from Proverbs because Solomon tells us that time and time again. A reaction may be appropriate, but guard carefully how you react. Slow to express your anger. One more thing I'll give you from Proverbs. I like this. In Proverbs chapter 12, the words of the reckless, someone who's hasty and quick and just spouts it out, the words of a reckless, they'll pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise can bring healing. See, sometimes I'm putting it out there because that's what I'm thinking, that's what I'm feeling. Next thing you know, I'm slicing you to pieces. It's bloody now, and we're taking our sides. The words of the wise are thinking, how can I tell you what needs to be said and move it forward in a positive way? It's what you and I call constructive criticism. I mean, there's criticism, but there's constructive criticism that figures out what's the best way to say it and say it well and get something positive out of this. Now, there's more I can give you from the book of Proverbs as well as the rest of Scripture, but are you getting the idea? Think before you promise. Think before you speak. I got to give you one more. Think before you tweet. Or whatever it is you do. I'm not into the Twitter thing. I don't know how it works. Don't have it. I'm not into Instagram and what's that, Snapfish chat things. I don't do any of those. What I do is I do Facebook, and I only know enough to be dangerous with it. A little bit of texting as well. But I will tell you this. I learned myself from making mistakes that you got to be careful with what you post. And so, for example, let me give you some of my rules I work by. One is pause before push. I tell you what, I get wound up sometimes, and I'm typing a masterpiece. This thing could be printed. But I always take my hands off the keyboard, and I look at it, and I think about it before I push the button to send or post, because sometimes after I read it through again, and I've calmed down a bit, I change it. I edit it and make it better. I need it to slow down. Pause before you push. I'll tell you what I've also done. Maybe you have done this. I've sometimes had to go back and edit or delete because I didn't feel good about it afterwards. Felt uneasy. I sent it, and the next thing you know, I'm looking at it, and I'm thinking about it next. I'm opening it back up, and I'm taking that off. Or I'm changing it. Because sometimes, you know how we do when we're joking around? We love to tease one another. We love to have fun. And we like that kind of thing. But sometimes, I'll say something, I thought it was funny. Until after I step back and think about it, and then I'm thinking, I hope you thought it was funny. Because maybe you thought I was picking on you. Maybe you felt offended. The more I read it, the more uneasy I feel about it. Next thing you know, I go back in there and I change it. I take it off. I don't know, you might have had a great laugh, but I decided I'm going to play it safe. And so I pull back. I'll tell you one more word to the wise, because this is what I do as well. I like public praise and private criticism. When you're praising someone, man, you can do that as loud as you want. I could do it from the stage, and you'd love it that I gave you an applause. And I love public praise, but if I'm going to criticize you, I think I probably should talk to you and talk to you one-on-one. I think that's a very biblical way of doing it. Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 18, you got a beef with somebody, go to them. If that's not going anywhere, take another person or two, and by 2 or 3 witnesses, deal with it. But most of us just skip right over that. Next thing you know, in an age of social media, we're just telling everybody. I'm going to recommend you go back to the Matthew 18 way. And when you need to criticize, criticize. When you disagree, disagree. But let's do it right. Public praise and private criticism, I think that's our best way to go. And the list could go on and on of other things that we could learn as well as we try to take a lesson from Jephthah. But you're getting the idea, aren't you? Think. Think before you promise and before you speak and before you do anything, and make sure it's what you want to do. It represents who you are. It represents your character. It represents our Lord. That's how we want to operate. I like a word from Proverbs. When Proverbs is wrapping this up for us in chapter 13, verse 3, it's a good finale. He says, those who will guard their tongue, their lips, guard their words, watch what they say, and that'll keep you safe. On the other hand, those who are reckless and move fast with haste, and they get in all types of trouble. I think the smart thing is we think before we speak. We learn a lesson from Jephthah, the man who spoke too soon.